Now that we've installed the Active Directory files, it's time to install the forest. So in order to do that, we have a nice flow chart that we can use that'll give us an idea of that whole process. So to do the forest deployment, we are going to have to go in and configure it. So to configure it, we're going to walk through a wizard, and one of the first screens we will see with that wizard will be the deployment configuration option. This is where we're going to choose to add a new forest. After that, we will be met with our domain controller options, and this is where we're going to decide what forest functional level to use, what domain functional level to use, and the like. We will then come to a screen where we are going to select our DNS options, and it's at that point we will have an opportunity, if we'd like, to say which DNS servers we'd like to have answer client requests within our network. After that, we will have some additional options like the NetBIOS name that we'll want to configure. After that, we will move into paths, and from paths we will figure out where we're going to store our database, our log, and our sysvol folder. After that, we will get a chance to review some of the options that we've selected and decide whether or not we want to move forward. After that, we will have the opportunity to configure, if we'd like, through a script in PowerShell, all the options that we've worked with up to this far in this wizard, which is a very nice option. We will then move into a prerequisite check. It's going to check to see if we meet all the prerequisites in order to install a forest, in our case, with Active Directory. If we pass that check, then we will move on into installation, and after that we will have, hopefully, a new forest. Now that we've installed the Active Directory files, it's time for us to go in and actually install the forest. So what we're going to do is we can do this from two spots. We can either choose promote this server to the domain controller from here, inside of our installation progress window, or we can go up to the top and we can look at our little notifications area, and we can see that we have a post deployment configuration option. So from either spot. So I'm going to click on promote this server, and I have three options. Now we'll be coming back to this same spot in just a bit to show you how to add a domain controller to an existing domain, and even eventually how to add a new domain to an existing forest. But for right now, we're going to take a look at adding a new forest. So when we do that, it wants to know what name we're going to use for this root of our new forest. And so we have to have planned this out a little bit ahead of time and thought through exactly what we wanted to call our new forest. So it has to be a fully qualified domain name, or an FQDN, and the name I'm going to choose here is going to be contoso.com. Now the name that you'll select is really going to be dependent upon all the planning that you've gone through to figure out what you want to call your internal domain, and it's probably going to relate somewhat to the name of your company. I'm then going to click on Next. Next, we're going to be looking at our window called Domain Controller Options. And from the Domain Controller Options, this is where we're going to pick our forest functional level and our domain functional level. Now notice some of the options that you have for the forest functional level. You can go as far back as Windows Server 2008 if you'd like. Now if you do that, you're going to have additional features that are available from the 2008 forest functional level that may not be what you want to use for 2016. So your best bet is, if you can, put this to the highest level, which is going to be for whatever the lowest domain controller you have in your forest is. So if the lowest domain controller or the oldest domain controller in my forest is 2008, I really can't set the forest functional level to 2016 because that 2008 system would not be able to function. So I'm going to have to choose the oldest domain controller that I have. What's the version of that? And that would be my highest forest functional level that I can choose. So I'm going to pretend that I can just choose 2016 and get all the bells and whistles here. The domain functional level works the exact same way. So I need to figure out what domain functional levels I can work with. Now since I chose the forest functional level at 2016, then that means I can only have domain controllers that are 2016. So that's my only option at this point. And again, you're going to have to kind of look through the domain controllers that you have and what's the oldest one that you have. And that will be the highest level for the forest functional level that you can choose going forward here. You can also at this point decide whether or not you want to make a DNS server available on this same domain controller. It's actually a pretty good practice to do that, but you might already have a DNS structure set up in your network. And if you do have a DNS structure, then maybe you don't want this to be the DNS server also. So it just kind of depends, but it's a good practice to put the two together if this is the very first, the very first time that you're really setting up an Active Directory domain. You'll also note here that you can make a global catalog server if you'd like. So this domain controller can be a global catalog server. You can also do this a little bit later. We're going to see in one of the Active Directory snap-ins we can do that. You'll also note too that you could make this a read-only domain controller. Now, since this is the very first domain controller for this forest, you really can't make it a RODC. But if this were not the very first domain controller for the forest, then you could make it an RODC, or read-only domain controller. So we're going to go with, I like having the DNS server selected, and the global catalog server is fine also for us. And then you're going to see too that you have to have a directory services restore mode password. Whatever you select here as your password, you are going to need to write down, and you will need to make certain that you can remember it going forward, because if something happens to Active Directory and you have to bring it back, this is the password they're going to ask for. So this is a good one to have written somewhere, and it could be maybe years before you might need it. And if that's the case, you're going to have to remember what it is. There is a tool that you can use to recover this. The NTDS util utility can be used from the command line to recover this, but this is something that you're going to want to remember. So I'm going to type a password in right now that I can remember, I'm hoping, for at least a short period of time here. And in our next screen, we're going to see our DNS options. Now with DNS options, what you're seeing here is it's giving us an error message where it says a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authorized parent zone cannot be found. That is a very typical error to get at this screen, and it's typical because it's trying to contact, remember we did contoso.com, so it's trying to contact the parent domain, which would be the com domain, and it doesn't have access to that. So this is a very typical error to get. The next thing you can do on this screen is you can specify our DNS delegation options. This will give us the ability to create DNS delegation. So this is deciding which DNS servers are going to answer which client's requests for finding people in our network. At this point, I'm just going to keep it the way it is. So I'm going to click on Next. When we get to the additional options screen, this is where we can type in our NetBIOS name. So this is a name that we can use for older systems, and notice it pops it in automatically for us as Contoso. The NetBIOS names are about 15 characters max, so notice it took off the .com because the NetBIOS name is 15 characters and it can't handle the dot. So it just picks up as Contoso, and this should work out pretty well for us. I don't think there's going to be a need to use NetBIOS unless we're talking about, if you have systems maybe from like the early 2000s, like Windows 2003 or earlier, you might need to use NetBIOS, but not for the systems 2008 and later. In our next screen, we can see paths, and this is where we can pick where we'd like to store our database, where we'd like to store our log files, and where we'd like to store sysvol. Sysvol is going to come in handy a little bit later on because that is the folder that we are going to use when we would like to edit a group policy object. They're all edited through sysvol, so that'll come in handy a little bit later on down the road. The database and log, remember that Active Directory is a database. So where do I want to store it? It goes into NTDS, and then from there a little bit later on we'll talk about how we can compress it, how we can defrag it, how we can manage it a bit. But this should work for right now. This is a good spot for right now on the C drive. Notice we can now review our selections. So we can read through this and we can see some of the selections that we made. And if need be, hit the previous button to go back and make changes. Note too that we can also view a script. So there's a PowerShell script that's going to be created. It's a good idea to actually view this script and export the script, save it, because in the event that I wanted to see how this domain controller was configured, I'd have the ability to prove that through the script. And I could also use that maybe for installing additional domain controllers down the road if I wanted to have the same configurations. So it's a good idea to have the script. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And then from here you can see our prerequisites. And it's looking to see if we have the ability to have a forest domain controller put on this server. So it will tell us if there's any issues. And once it passes this check, we'll be able to install it. Now what we're looking at in the prerequisite check area is we're seeing a number of areas that are telling us that the little yellow caution signs, they look like caution signs, but they're just telling us that if we click the install, the server is going to automatically reboot at the end of that section. So a lot of this is just little FYIs. But the most important part is as we move to the bottom, we're going to see that we have a prerequisite check has been completed. We will also see that all prerequisite checks have been passed successfully. So it's safe for us to install. But we're not going to install at this point because we already have another forest named A Datum, and we'll move forward with that forest.